So my name is Tom Curtin, and I have the great honor today of being your Master of Ceremonies for this wonderful event that celebrates the life of Richard Hughes. I looked around this room and looked at the guest invitation list and thought, this is like legal Disney World. Celebrities from all over the place in the political realm and the legal realm. This is going to be an Irish event today. That means there'll be some laughs and some tears and some exaggerations, or as some people prefer to call them, some lies. But they will be about someone that we love and we respect. I'm delighted that people have traveled from all over just to be with us today. Retired Chief Judge Garrett Brown came here from Zanzibar. True. Governor Florio was able to change his schedule to join us today. Governor Kane distinguishes us with his presence here today to talk about their friend. Several of our federal judges, Jose Linares, Dennis Kavanaugh, Bill Walsh, have left Giants training camp just to be with you. So as we honor and remember the Chief Justice and Governor, I think it's important that I give you at least a lesson that he gave to me once. I asked him, how do you prefer to be called? He told me that he had done some research, or perhaps had talked to former Ambassador and Governor Ribikoff about whether you are titled Chief Justice or whether you are titled Governor. And according to Governor Hughes, John Weffing may comment on this later in his comments, that you are called by the name that the people gave you. So you can call him Chief Justice if you like. I think he would have preferred Governor among his other wonderful titles of dad and grandfather and husband. So I'm going to ask you, if you will, each in your own words, each in your own way, let us begin in the same way that Richard Hughes began each and every day and ended each and every day with a prayer. Lord, we honor today a man to whom the road always rose before him. And we honor a man who the sun always shined warmly on his face. And we honor a man who the rain always fell softly on his fields. And one thing we know for sure, that he's in heaven, smiling at his friends who gather here today in his honor. So speaking of having traveled a great distance, our first speaker is the Chief Justice of the state of New Jersey. He came all the way from the 8th floor to be with us today. And I'm delighted to introduce Chief Justice Stuart Rapper.
Thank you, Tom. It was a tough elevator ride. I'm glad that we were able to make it with only a few stops. And all I could think about during your remarks was how many people are going to come up to you afterward and ask you which Disney characters you associate with the many legal leaders that are here today. Governors Kane, Florio, colleagues on the bench and bar, and our special guests, friends and family of the late Governor and Chief Justice. What an honor to be able to welcome you here to this special commemoration to celebrate the life of the former Governor and Chief Justice. I want to thank the State Bar Association and Foundation, members of the Hughes family, for starting the conversation that led to today's event. I also want to thank Professor John Weffing, who I know will be speaking later, who captured the Chief and the Governor so beautifully in his book, a marvelous resource that will live on for years and that all of us get to benefit from today and in the future. Now, the single sentence that often is used to characterize the person we remember today and summarize his life is that he was the only person to serve as both Governor and Chief Justice in our state's history. But if you start the timeline then, you may lose some important events as we sit here in the Hughes Justice Complex. After all, before being elected governor, this talented, young, able practitioner and former Assistant United States Attorney was named to the bench. He was the last person to be nominated under the former Constitution and took to the bench 5 days before the current modern Constitution went into effect, a Constitution that he certainly left his mark on. And he was so highly regarded by the first Chief Justice, Arthur Vanderbilt, that he was used as a troubleshooter, assigned to a number of complicated cases, and sent throughout the state. He sat in 11 of the 21 counties of New Jersey, from Cape May to Sussex. Compare that to the rotation program that we now have. He also served as assignment judge in Union County and was appointed to the appellate division by Chief Justice Weintraub. And then he returned to private practice before running and winning 2 terms as governor that I will leave to others to speak about, and then back to private practice again, where he was extremely successful at attracting clients, servicing their cases, and earning a salary that had eluded him as the chief executive and the chief justice. Now, this popular former governor could have done anything at this point in his career, and yet he chose to accept the honor of the nomination to serve as chief justice. And let's pause for a second and think about what a statement that was. Think about what it said about his view of how important the system of justice was and is in the life of our state and the lives of our citizens, that he was willing to rededicate himself to public service, a new chapter, serving in this sphere. His work, his tenure from 1973 to 1979 as Chief Justice, is recounted in Professor Weffing's book. It also lives on in the administrative initiatives that he undertook and the opinions that he wrote that we still read and cite to today. But beyond that, so many have commented on his humility and decency, his ability and willingness to listen to others, his knowledge, his integrity, and how all of that served him well in helping him lead the court. And add to that what one former clerk described as his instinct for justice. When he retired at the age of 70, as required to do, he wrote and spoke often about the court system, about the importance of its independence, and described it repeatedly as the best in the country. We still feel his presence today. Attorneys, members of the public gather to argue and to watch oral arguments in cases before the Supreme Court on the 8th floor of the Hughes Justice Complex. And when those cases are discussed days later by the justices in a conference room, his prominent portrait, with a warm smile and a confident bearing, looks out over all of us sitting around that conference table. But I think his true contribution endures beyond the name on the building and the portrait and the other formal remembrances that have been bestowed over the years. It's his message that lives on by inspiring so many people to serve in public service and to do so with decency and with civility, living up to the standard that he set himself. And for that, the citizens of our state have every reason to be grateful, and it's only fitting that we gather here today, 50 years after he took the oath to serve the public fairly, justly, and impartially. Thank you all for making time to remember this great leader and to take time to reflect on his way of life.
Thank you, Chief. I know that Chief Justice and Governor Hughes would be proud to call you one of his colleagues and successors. Now, our next speaker is our Attorney General. I have a little conflict of interest I have to disclose here. He not only is the Attorney General of New Jersey, but he's the backfield coach of the Notre Dame football team. And I'm not sure how he's going to do both of those jobs for the citizens of New Jersey or for the backs at Notre Dame. But I'm sure he'll figure a way. He was a very excellent, extraordinary counsel to the governor, and the governor showed great confidence in him in selecting him to be his Attorney General. I'm delighted to introduce to you Jeff Chiesa.
Thank you, Tom, and good morning to everybody, Governors Kane and Florio, and all of our distinguished guests here today. I am a big college football fan, and this is the time of year for college football where, for Notre Dame fans like Tom and I, hope springs eternal because we're 0-0 again and we're going to be undefeated next year, hopefully. But it is the time of year where all the schools are looking to replenish their teams, and during the next 3 weeks is when college football recruits will finalize their commitments to their schools and make decisions. Schools hoping they're making the right decisions, and the players hoping that they're making the right decisions as well. While these schools are looking for talent, strength, speed, and the ability to perform on the field, what they're really looking for in these players, and what they're really going to fight for at the end, are what they refer to as difference makers. Difference makers are the guys who can go on the field and perform on the field in a with incredible talent, incredible precision, and incredible effectiveness. What these players also have, though, is a second feature, and that's a leadership feature. The leadership feature allows them off the field, in the locker room, and during the off-season to make their teams better. That's why these difference makers are so important to these colleges and why the colleges fight so hard for them. At bottom, Governor Hughes was a difference maker for New Jersey. He lent his extraordinary talent willingly and selflessly so that New Jersey could succeed in every way. When you think for a minute about having the job as governor and then having the job as Chief Justice, it's a pretty overwhelming thought. For any of us that have had the chance to serve in a position, and they're all positions of public trust, it's an enormous honor and it's an enormous sacrifice for your families because of the time, commitment, and effort that it takes. The Chief Justice and Governor Hughes, from a large family, twice made that commitment. And so it's fitting that we sit here today in the building named for him, a building that not only houses our Supreme Court, where people come to have their cases played, but also houses the Attorney General's office. I can't think of a better tribute to somebody, anybody who served in public service, than to have a building called the Justice Complex after them. His legacy, as the Chief Justice just recounted for everybody, is extraordinary. What's also extraordinary is that his legacy continued well past his own career in the form of the commitment to public service that his family has made. His children, as we know, have held significant positions in government, throughout government, and one that I particularly want to talk about is Helen Patterson, who works in the Attorney General's office. So it's not only the mark of this man that he was able, through his own efforts, to attain the job of governor and Chief Justice, but a tremendous legacy that he's left us with is the continuing commitment that his family's given to this state to make the state better every day. Thank you very much for inviting me here this morning.
Thank you, General. This event, as you know from the invitations you received, was coordinated by a number of people, and I can tell you that without the great support of the New Jersey Bar Foundation and the New Jersey Bar Association, this event would not have occurred. So I'm delighted to introduce to you our next speaker, the President of the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, Stuart Letterman.
Thank you, Tom, former governors, attorney generals, members of the Supreme Court, judges. It's humbling, just by virtue of my position, to be speaking here today in the Hughes Justice Complex. But on behalf of the Bar Foundation, I want to thank you all for being here today to commemorate this special occasion, the 50th anniversary of the inauguration of Governor, who was one of the most respected, dedicated, and if you read John Wepping's book, and if you know him at all, one of the most beloved figures in New Jersey history, whose name is rightfully inscribed on the facade of this complex. And he was so dedicated, a person who was so dedicated to the system of justice in the state, Richard J. Hughes. You've heard others already mention, he was unique in the annals of New Jersey history because he served both as governor for 2 terms, no less, and then as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. I would say having those positions and having this complex named after him is a trifecta that most of us can only dream of. When I read John Wepping's book several years ago, in addition to all the terrific work that Governor Hughes did, one of the things that struck me was how devoted he was to his family, and that notwithstanding the efforts and the time he put into everything he did, it all came back to family. And if you haven't had a chance to look at some of the displays here in the lobby, I encourage you to do so. But if you look at his family is framed in the one display by his work as governor and by his work as Chief Justice. And that's something I think we all need to recognize, that despite all the work he did, he always returned to family. For many people, Governor Hughes was the face of governance and law in New Jersey. He was known as a progressive, consensus builder, one who reached out across the aisle, regardless of ideology. Last year, when several people were asked to name their favorite governor, 3 Newark politicos, State Senator Robert Scarsone, a Republican, former Assemblyman George Richardson, a Democrat, and North Ward Democratic leader Steve Adubato all immediately, without hesitation, named Governor Hughes. And when he was appointed Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, it was by a Republican governor, William Cahill. These are only a snippet of the high esteem he was held throughout his long career by the people of New Jersey. You'll hear more about this remarkable individual from people who are much better qualified than me to speak about him. Once again, thank you for coming. Tom?
The governors, don't worry about that poll. You two are 2 and 3, so. I said before that without the support of the New Jersey Bar Association and its leadership, many of whom are here today, we would not be able to have this event and would not be able to pay the kind of respect to our Governor and Chief Justice. And I'm delighted to introduce to you from the McCarter and English firm, the President of the New Jersey State Bar, Susan Feeney.
Thank you. And on behalf of the State Bar Association, I welcome you all here today. Many members of the State Bar know the name Richard Hughes from the building we are gathered in today, and also from the statue of Chief Justice Hughes, which stands at the entrance of the New Jersey State Bar Center in New Brunswick. Indeed, every judge and attorney in New Jersey can find some way to relate to Richard Hughes because he's held so many different positions in his legal career. He was in private practice, served as an assistant U.S. attorney, became a county court judge, rose up the ladder to Superior Court, was appointed assignment judge, and served on the appellate division. And ultimately, he was appointed by Governor Cahill as Chief Justice of the New Jersey Supreme Court. However, it was in his role as governor that Richard Hughes left his mark on the New Jersey State Bar Association. Since the days of Governor Driscoll, a judicial appointments committee of the State Bar had functioned informally to advise each governor of the qualifications of candidates for the judiciary. In the 1960s, the State Bar Association envisioned a substantial public benefit in developing and implementing a formal process for the evaluation of candidates for judicial office. The State Bar did not want to impose limitations on the constitutional powers of the governor or the state senate. However, it did want to devise procedures by which the State Bar could assist the governor in seeking outstanding candidates for appointment to the judiciary and could assure the Senate, the Bar, and the general public of the qualifications of the proposed appointees. Governor Hughes agreed with this concept, and he had the foresight to formalize the process. Working with the State Bar, he advocated for both a judicial selection committee and a judicial appointments committee, which would act independent of each other. The selection committee would seek out the best talent for the bench, and the appointments committee would vet the candidates the governor proposed to nominate. On September 25th, 1969, Governor Hughes signed a resolution with the State Bar Association, giving the Judicial Appointments Committee of the State Bar authority to confidentially review and report on the qualifications of candidates for judicial positions and for prosecutor positions. This became known as the Hughes Compact. This compact has been renewed by every governor since Richard Hughes, ensuring that the governor receives the best evaluation and guidance on each candidate. From Governor Hughes' time in office and through the present administration of Governor Christie, as part of the compact, the New Jersey State Bar Association's Judicial and Prosecutorial Appointments Committee, which we also refer to as JPAC, conducts extensive interviews and reviews potential candidates to the tax court, Superior Court, Supreme Court, as well as the county prosecutor positions. I should mention that this year's JPAC chair is William Greenberg, one of my partners at McCarter, and Bill actually was one of Governor Hughes' assistant counsels. And every time we have a JPAC meeting this year, Bill begins the meeting by informing the candidate that's sitting in front of us of the importance of the compact and always mentions the legacy of Governor Hughes when we do interview the candidate. This compact is also an example of the devotion to judicial independence and integrity that Richard Hughes valued, both as governor and as Chief Justice. The independence and integrity of our judiciary has been one of the most foremost achievements since the 1947 Constitution. The State Bar Association believes the strength of our judiciary is best served by insulating those serving on the bench from politics that may underline the executive and legislative branches. That independence is absolutely essential and must be guarded. The Hughes Compact helps protect and promote this concept of judicial independence. Through the Hughes Compact, there is the assurance of the nonpartisan evaluation of candidates for judicial office. So, to the members of the Hughes family that are here today, on behalf of the New Jersey State Bar Association, we pledge that we will continue to uphold the value of the Hughes Compact. We are deeply thankful to Governor Richard Hughes for the wisdom he had in creating this compact nearly 5 decades ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. We were so delighted to learn yesterday that kind of at the last minute, Governor Florio was able to adjust his busy schedule to be able to join us today. And I'm delighted to have him with us. We're going to make him do double duty today and participate not only in giving opening welcoming remarks, but also participate in our panel discussion. I read, and I told him earlier that I read Governor Hughes' obituary yesterday. And one of the quotes from Governor Florio was that the governor practiced the politics of joy. I think that's a pretty able description of the person that we respected and cared for so much. So for introductory and welcoming remarks, former Governor Jim Florio.
To all the distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, let me just express to you how pleased I am to have been asked to take part in the program today as we try to not only celebrate, but learn from the life and the legacy of Governor Hughes. I first met Governor Hughes in the 60s when I was a law student, but I was also a part-time legislative aide to Assemblyman John Horn from Camden County. That was an experience that was very beneficial to me. The 60s, as I think we all remember, some of us remember, was a period much like the one we're in now. A period of great change, great turmoil, change that was not normal change that is rapid, very dramatic, very complex, and accordingly, very stressful. And the governor was up to dealing with policies that had to be implemented in those times. Because that type of change requires policies that are not just systemic changes, not just marginal, incremental changes, but changes that are transformational. And he was up to it. If you recall, many can recall, he dealt with very heavy subjects: civil rights, civil liberties, academic freedom, taxation policies, reorganizing higher education. He did all those things, and what was startling to me upon reflection was how those stressful changes were done with relative collegiality, relative cooperation, even on a partisan basis. And that, of course, is a dramatic change from the times we find ourselves in now, when we have the venomous politics that we practice, polarized politics, lack of civility that is really the hallmark of a policy-making process all across the nation. And that's a troubling thing. I think in some respects, the success of Governor Hughes was largely a result of the tone that he set. He set a respectful tone, he set a collegial tone, a collaborative tone, and that was him. It reflected his values. Let me just conclude with an observation about probably the most significant interaction that I personally had with the governor. In 1991, in the midterm of my election, we had an election for the legislature. And as I can remember vividly, and you can probably remember as well, the outcome was not as pleasant as it could be, as far as I was concerned. Where the opposition prevailed with overwhelming veto-proof majorities. The next day, at Drumthwacket, I received a call from Governor Hughes. And he very solicitedly commiserated with me. And then he gave me a piece of advice. He said, I had the same situation occur with me. The midterm elections turned out very badly. We had overwhelming majorities on the other side. And the way I dealt with it is the way I would suggest you deal with it. Accommodate as much as you possibly can, but never compromise on matters of principle. I followed that advice and had a relatively productive 2-year session. So I would just suggest to all of us that that's very good advice for all of us to follow through upon. Those of us who had the pleasure and the honor of interacting with him directly have benefited from it very much. But I would make the argument in the larger sense of the word, everybody in New Jersey, then and now and ever since, has benefited from interaction with the governor, directly or even indirectly. He was a great man, and we all have benefited from that. Thank you very much.
So now that we've teed this up,
We're going to let you ask some questions if anybody wants to ask questions today from the audience, and we're going to be able to do that. I wanted to express, John Hughes is going to be our concluding speaker today and who will express his appreciation, but I wanted to particularly thank Acting Administrative Director Glenn Grant for his hospitality in helping arrange all of this for us today. Thank you, Judge Grant, very, very much. And I wanted to acknowledge the work of Cindy Pellegrino from the New Jersey State Bar Foundation and Angela Scheck, the Executive Director of the State Bar, for their help in putting this all together. So let me start with the governors. Governor Kane, Governor Hughes said in an interview I saw that he'd call you while you were governor and say to you, "Hi, it's your do-gooder buddy." Tell me about that.
Well, he did, and he didn't just call. You know, it's when I was governor, it was interesting. First of all, he was always there for advice, any kind of advice, and I lent on him quite often for very good advice. But he'd come and not only call and say it's your do-gooder buddy, but he'd just come and sit in the outer office. And Eddie McGlynn remembers somebody come in the office and says, "Governor Hughes is outside." And so you'd go out and bring him in. He'd always have something, it was always had a human touch. Democrats had been in for a long time before I became governor. And so the people in office were being phased out and Republicans were coming in to replace them. He had a very small list of people he knew very well. And they either were people who had had some medical problem, whose spouse had died or something, and they may only need one more year to get their pension. And he'd come in and he'd say, "You know, Mary over there, you don't know her, but you can leave her for another year or so." And so he always knew and cared about those people. And second, in a larger area, he'd often say to me, "You know, have you been to visit the people in the institutions?" He says, "You know, the governor goes to the institutions and the whole thing spruces up, and those people are taken much better care of. So I really wish you'd get out and see them." But that kind of advice, it was extraordinarily helpful. And of course, that sense of humor of his, you know, when he was if I saw him when I was at something, I'd always say, "You know, Governor, do you want to come up and say a few words?" And he'd always come up. And then he'd almost always start out with a line. He'd say, "You know, Betty Hughes always used to say that I would speak at every opening, even that of a manhole."
Governor, I know one of the real passions of former Governor Hughes was his work in organ donation, and you were instrumental with the State Bar Association and with the governor in the creation of the Sight and Life Committee, Governor Kane, and there's been some pictures that floated around of you and I a few years ago with Governor. Can you talk to us about that, how he approached you about supporting that Sight and Life and organ donation thing, which, if you don't know, that's why your driver's license today has an election on the back of your license, or did have an election on the back of your license for organ donation as a result of Governor Hughes' work.
Well, again, that was part of this wonderful human touch. I mean, he knew of people who had died because there was not a proper organ in place, and he cared about it. And so he approached me and said, "You know, we really ought to do something about that." And we got the bill and the program going. But it's typical of the kind of thing that he was always looking out for. He didn't have to be governor, chief justice, or an office anymore. He still cared very, very much for those kind of things. We had a wonderful relationship, you know. And a couple of times he said too many nice things about me, particularly with an election approaching. And so one time, one of the press, I don't know, it was probably Joe Katz or somebody, one of the press came up and said, "You know, Governor, you know, you said once, win any good Republicans, and yet you say all these good things about Tom Kean." He didn't hesitate for a minute. He said, "You know, there's got to be an exception to prove every rule."
Governor, I know, Governor Kane, I know one of the reasons that he was so interested in the Sight and Life thing is his beloved Betty had decided, as she was approaching the end of her life, that she was going to donate her eyes, and he was very prideful in the programs that we do around the state, dragging Bud Foley around with us and Jerry Breslin, and having him talk about the importance of organ donation, because in his view, Betty lived through the eyes of others. Governor Florio, you worked with him, he mentored you. Tell us about him.
He was always giving advice to the point of trying to come to some commonalities. His whole approach was not to find the differences, but to find the things that brought people together, and then find even something you could have in common with political opponents, and then work from that to expand. One of the things he said to my wife, which was very nice and regarded as the ultimate compliment, he said she reminded him of Betty. And Lucinda always took that as sort of the ultimate compliment that one could be paid. That he was somebody that really worked very hard and was very substantive. You know, we all know political people who are not as substantive as they could be, but he had style and substance, a wonderful combination. Some of us have substance with not a whole lot of style. Others have the combination of that. But he was really always a pleasure and was very forthcoming with advice, and would call from time to time about thoughts that he would have about common problems that were there. And everything he offered by way of advice was good advice.
I know Susan, in her remarks, talked about the importance of the judicial compact, and both of you supported that compact, of course. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of judicial selection to the governor
Can you
and to
repeat it
yourselves?
again?
I wanted to see whether or not I could get you to talk, each of you talk about the importance of the judicial compact with the State Bar Association and the selection of judges for our state. That he initiated that, and you both continued that practice while you were governors.
Yeah, it was very, very important part of the process, particularly for me, because I was the first governor in a long time, I guess, who hadn't been a lawyer. And so I didn't know anything about you guys. And, so I didn't know, you know, when these legislators who recommend people, you know, sometimes they recommend good people, sometimes they recommend dreadful people. I was not a lawyer, so I didn't often know the difference. And so the idea of having the Bar Association be able to screen these people, and even more than the Bar Association, I had, and I think Governor Hughes was one of the people who advised me to do this, I had a sort of a secret committee of 3 or 4 people, a couple of former Supreme Court justices, a head of one of the older head of one of the largest law firms in the state, and I would submit everybody I'd never heard of to them. And they would give me a private recommendation as to what they thought of them as a quality nominee for the bar. And if, you know, if they weren't quality, I would have a big fight often with a legislator, but I wouldn't nominate them. And the combination of the Bar Association review and that select committee enabled me, with the help of a couple of good counsels, to make, I think, some very, very fine judicial nominations.
None of those turkeys that he was talking about ever made it to the bench. I can tell. I've looked out of this room. None of them ever made it to the bench.
Not in this room.
Not in this room. Governor Florio, your experience with the compact following in that tradition.
I regard it as something that was a great benefit to me. I mean, I've seen others who have said it's a burden and a hindrance on the governors. And I really never thought of it as that way. Very much as Tom mentioned, it's a good screen. Ultimately, the decision would be mine, subject to obviously confirmation. But I thought that the compact initiative was something that made good sense, good politics, good policy, and so I never had any difficulty whatsoever with going forward and fulfilling it.
Can you tell me, I want to move on a bit in our discussion, but can you tell me, either of you tell me whether you ever, under any circumstances, ever heard anyone say anything bad about Governor Hughes? And what was it?
The only thing I ever heard was sometimes people would feel that they left the office with a yes. It would not be a total yes. It would be a partial yes. And then someone else would leave the office and they would have an opposite view, and they thought they may have left with a yes. So he had the skill of trying to make sure that everyone felt they were not totally rejected. Some people thought that might have been carried out to an extreme. But that trying to bring people together was a virtue, and in a couple of people's minds, it may not have been totally.
I think he learned that from the Jesuits at St. Joe's. I think that's where he picked that up. Governor?
Yeah, he was, you know, I was elected in that legislature that Governor Florio mentioned, where after the riots, which was a very difficult thing for any governor to deal with, followed by an election of a tremendous number of Republicans. He thought that both those things were disasters. But he had so many Republicans that I don't know if we had a veto proof, it was pretty close. And people like me, I'd never been to Trenton when I was elected, never even been to the city. And all of a sudden, I was leader of the largest delegation in the legislature. And all the legislation having to do with the answer to the riot, so trying to do something about it, had to go through basically our delegation and our sponsorship. And his understanding and his graciousness in dealing with these new Republicans, and his humility in doing so. And between us, we got a tremendous amount accomplished, including the first urban aid bills, including the Education Opportunity Fund, including so many things which are still very, very important to the state. And it was Hughes doing that with a legislature that was tremendously Republican. And the leaders and people like myself and Ray Bateman, I don't think we ever heard a bad word about Governor Hughes. Disagreements, but on a personal basis, I don't think either of us certainly didn't ever say a bad word, but I don't think we ever heard a bad word in that regard.
Thank you for those insights. We, those of you who know and have followed the career of Governor and Chief Justice know that his seminal case was in Ray Quinlan. If you look at the display, and I hope you will after we've finished our program, that you'll spend some time. We are honored today to have with us the mother of Karen Ann Quinlan, and I'd like to introduce her to you. This is Julia Quinlan. And a little grayer than he was 36 years ago, they were, I should say, Judge Paul Armstrong, who was the family attorney for the Quinlans, and retired Morris County Prosecutor and Appellate Division Judge Donald G. Collister, Jr. So, Paula, I'm going to tee you up for these series of questions a little bit about Quinlan, because it's such an important case, such an important part of New Jersey's history, and such an important part of the legacy of Karen Ann Quinlan. I asked Governor Hughes once in a train ride, Governor came when we were going around on Slight Life, how did you ever get that court to vote 7-0? Go look at the individuals in that, of the picture in that court, different philosophies, different approaches, and he told me that they recognized the case as so important and so significant that they worked out all of their issues in advance, each of the concerns that the justices towards the more moderate side or the more liberal side or the more conservative side were able to come together with an opinion for which he was so proud and which he authored. Paula?
It is an amazing case. When I was looking over the literature, since I was one of the few that didn't have the privilege of meeting him directly, you'll see such cases, this case described it sometimes as the landmark case or the seminal case, referring to Hughes' lasting legacy by this case alone. It spurred dozens of law review articles and treatises in the medical field. It spurred an entire new way of thinking called The Right to Die with Dignity Thoughts. And all this came out of one very tragic and yet amazing situation and facts that dealt with. You talk about the ability of this great man to get a unanimous opinion, which was so important. I guess I saw in one paragraph in your book that you talk about, I think one of his nicknames was Buckets, or Two Buckets. And he was known for being the great mediator and conciliator, and that's what he did so well as governor. And I think perhaps his shining masterpiece of those skills were found in what he did with the Quinlan case, to be able to take such a controversial, passionate issue and bring it all together in one unanimous decision. I thought it would be important to look at what was going on at the time the Quinlan case came up, and how it was being viewed in the publicity. At the time the case was first arose in 75 and 76, I was in undergraduate school. I've talked to people here who were in law school at the time. There were flyers all over my campus with the picture that you see on one of the walls of a beautiful young 22-year-old girl with long brunette hair and piercingly sensitive eyes. And that was the Karen Quinlan that we all looked at and thought, how can this decision be made? But the reality is what the family was so going through was so torturous and so difficult a decision. When you look into the strength of the family, a very strong and passionate Catholic family that went out of their way in love of children to adopt this beautiful girl and bring her into their lives, and then to get that call that so transformed not only this family but a nation about what she suffered through. And you think back on what the decision did. Today, we take for granted, many often of us, when there are decisions of life and death at the end of life of those who are suffering. We don't realize how little was done. There was no law, no legislation in 1975 and 1976. The Quinlan case really brought it all to a head. And if you just look at some of the comments that came out after the decision was made, you might read about Walter Cronkite on CBS News on the day the decision came out. He opened his news with the words, "The Supreme Court of New Jersey ruled today on an issue that has tormented the conscience of the legal and medical professions." It was in the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, LA, was all over. It was an international story. It triggered so much in our minds. It changed so much. I thought about what's the lasting legacy of this really important case and the man who on his own penned the entire case. He wasn't one to send it out to law clerks. He wrote it on his own. I think you'd say that it triggered a public discourse like no other. It triggered documents that we take for granted now. The documents on medical treatment prior to dying. It triggered the hospice care that is still going on today in the name of Karen Ann Quinlan that the family started in connection with this. I ask you to think about what this case did for a nation, what it does for all of our lives when we take care for an elderly one. I look at the lasting legacy of it, and I think about the creation of ethics committees, the debate that now rages on greatly about bioethics and where we stand today. We think about the various statutes that were triggered after this decision about rights to death and decisions in choosing. Perhaps you could say Jack Kevorkian and all his controversy stemmed out of the furor that stood around this case. Living wills, advanced directives, all those came out of this great case. The right to die movement, of course, we talked about. But I would think that if we talk finally about the legacy of the man, we'd end with his words. And I thought it was interesting to note, after he had left the bench, no longer Chief Justice, what then Governor Hughes talked about when he said public service. And he said that I believe that governors, chief justices, and judges alike all should have a restlessness, a kind of impatience for doing of more justice, for the satisfying of more human needs, to make government act in the interest of people who create government. If that wasn't the penultimate of what was done in the Karen Ann Quinlan case and what he devoted his entire life to, both as governor and on the bench, that's why we honor him.
I think that's a wonderful summary, Paula. John, you walk by his statue every day in the Seton Hall Law School, and for those of you, Susan and Stuart, at the Law Center, when you go through the Law Center or to the Law Center, you'll see this picture of this, with the statue of this wonderful smiling Irishman with his hand extended. I used to say he was always saying, "Hi, I'm Dick Hughes. I'm a New Jersey lawyer." That was my story. How did you get interested in the governor, and what led you to the writing of the book?
Interestingly, at that time, when I began thinking about this, I was serving as the Richard J. Hughes Professor at Seton Hall Law School. I don't know if that hasn't been mentioned yet, but when the Chief Justice stepped down from the bench, the state created a chair in his honor at Seton Hall Law School, and in fact, the governor held that chair for his first year, for the first year of the chair. And he ran a wonderful seminar and wrote a number of articles for the Law Review. And so he became a teacher as well. He was always a teacher in many ways, but he became a regular teacher at that time. And the story is somewhat interesting. I was sitting on the committee to determine who was going to get a sabbatical, and someone came in and said, I'd like to write an article about the founder of Opus Dei, and we gave him a sabbatical. And I said, don't have to write other law review articles, we could write a biography. I could write a biography, and I thought to myself, who didn't have a biography? I called actually both Michael Murphy and John Hughes, and I said, is there a biography of your dad? I didn't think there was. And they said, no. And I said, well, I think I'm going to write one. And so I did. And it was a wonderful experience because, in fact, I had known him somewhat. I had taught Michael Murphy many years ago and had gotten to know the governor, especially during the time when he taught at the law school, and I always had admired him. But as I proceeded to work on the book, I became more and more enamored of what a wonderful person this was. And you asked a question before. I actually went around, I think I interviewed at least 50 or 60 people, a good number of whom are in the audience today, as a matter of fact. And thank you all for being so accommodating for those efforts, including Mrs. Quinlan, for example. And as I went around, I actually asked people, in response to a question you asked before, give me the name of somebody who didn't like the governor. And nobody seemed to come up with an answer. And finally, one person did suggest a name. I think Senator so-and-so, I'm not going to mention the name, may have had his difficulties and may not have liked the governor. So, of course, I interviewed Senator so-and-so, and of course, he didn't agree with that. I didn't specifically say that to him, but I asked him about his feelings about the governor, and he was very complimentary as well. So it was a wonderful experience. And
can you tell me a little bit? One of his great tasks, I think, as governor, was his handling of the difficulties of the riots in Newark in the late '60s. He was sensitive to the racial concerns of the citizens of the city, and as well as the concerns of those who wanted to make sure that there was no inappropriate disobedience of our laws. Can you talk to that, please?
Sure. Certainly, it was probably one of his greatest challenges. To deal with that situation. As many of you know, we had riots for about 5 days in the city of Newark. I was taking the bar exam along with Governor Florio. During those terrible days, I think we were some of the few people who were going into Newark at that time. Most people were fleeing the city except for the troopers that were coming in. And as he described it himself, in his own words, he was awakened in the first day. Things seemed very bad in Newark. By the second day, things actually had calmed down a little bit, and he was in constant contact with the mayor, Adonisio, and Adonisio said, I think I can handle it. And so the governor went to sleep the second night saying, wake me if anything happens. At something like 2 o'clock in the morning, he gets a call frantically from Adonisio saying, my city is burning down. At that point, the governor felt he had nothing that he could do other than to call out the National Guard and to call out the state troopers, and immediately, in a signal of his own personal bravery and courage, he got in the car and immediately went into the city. And things were very bad at that time. There were disputes among how to handle the situation. There's a story that I tell in the book about the fact that he had contacted and had been in touch with Lyndon Johnson, then president, and Lyndon Johnson was offering to send troops in and the governor felt that would be inappropriate. He was really worried that if Southern troopers came into Newark, they might overreact. Unfortunately, some of his own National Guard were really not that trained in how to deal with a situation like that, and there was, in fact, some overreaction even among the National Guard from New Jersey. However, he showed his own willingness by going into and meeting, he and Ray Brown, many of you know Ray Brown, the senior Ray Brown, who was then probably the leading African-American attorney in the state by far. And he and Ray Brown went in, met with some very tough guys, people who Ray had represented in the past, and he did that with just one state trooper with him. And so he demonstrated his bravery at that point. And so the things began to get a little better. Eventually, he made the final decision to pull the troops out, and that really was the resolution of the problem. And while, unfortunately, it was a terrible situation, many people ended up being killed. There were rumors rife of many different snipers and things of that nature, some of which probably weren't even true. But it led him to be even more. He had always had concern over civil rights, but he became even more convinced of the needs. And I think Governor Kane mentioned a moment ago that when he became governor, Governor Hughes was still pushing the idea that we had to do more for the inner cities. And unfortunately, we still have more to do in that area, but he certainly worked to ameliorate some of the great problems in the cities.
Well, this event has a producer. That producer's name is also Hughes, and we have promised people that they can get back to work at some point. So I want to thank our panel very much for your wonderful remarks and introduce you to John Hughes, who will express appreciation on behalf of the family.
Thank you, Tom, for that introduction, and thank you, Tom, for everything you've done in connection with this event, and that means getting the Bar Association involved to begin with, raising money, keeping Professor Weffing under an hour and 45 minutes. And to the panel, I thank you. Governor Kane and Governor Florio, you completed this day, and General Dow, and our 11th sibling, John Weffing. I want to thank the ad hoc committee that Tom Curtin referred to, headed by Cindy Pellegrino and her talented associates at the Bar Foundation, Renee from the Judiciary, Rachel from the AG's office, Michael, my brother, Honey, Helen, my sister, and incidentally, the family's well represented here today. We had my brother Brian float through on his way to giving the State of the County address later. We have spouses, and we have grandchildren, we have nephews and nieces and in-laws and outlaws, so we're well represented. I want to thank the dependable Ed Fafara, the state police, the facilities people, and Jackie Busey, who planted this seed 2 years ago. Many thanks to Susan from the Bar Association and Stuart from the Foundation for leading this charge. We couldn't obviously have done it without you. To the welcoming speakers, the Chief Justice, the Attorney General, thank you very much. I also want to thank the Public Defender, the third tenant in the building, Joe Krikora, for inviting us into his house. My brother Michael and I and my son Adam all started out as assistant public defenders. And I want to thank particularly our generous benefactors who have allowed us to donate that magnificent exhibit over there to the complex. Last but not least, I want to thank our exhibit designer, Joanne Maestro, who put this together on short notice. And in my humble opinion, I believe that this work of art will serve as a lasting inspiration to every lawyer and every parent and every child that walks into this building. As Stuart indicated, central to that exhibit is his family. And you all know he was the father of 10 children, and he treated each one as if he or she was the favorite. Well, actually, as we all know, and really and frankly, I was actually the favorite. The great irony of this wonderful day is that if Richard Hughes walked through those front doors right now, he would be saying, "What's all that fuss about?" He would be stunned that it was about him. Aside from the many other qualities you've heard here today, he had an honest humility, born of self-confidence and faith in God that was absolutely genuine. He was never the most important person in the room. You were. Mindful that it's lunchtime and we've had a full day already, I remember as if it were yesterday, my father and I walking into an event like this, and after listening to perhaps one too many speeches, he would lean over and whisper, "You know, John, I was a young man when I first walked into this room tonight." Thank you, everybody. Be well.